More than 90 South Coast livestock producers joined the WA Livestock Research Council in Manypeaks to take a look inside the livestock systems that underpin the workings of two high-performing businesses. In this edition of Livestock Matters, WA Livestock Research Council Chairman Tim Watts talks to Kim Lester from Lester Pastoral Company to hear about the payback from his investment in a centre pivot and the role it plays in a grass-fed beef operation with a weekly turn-off. Kim farms a 3,000 hectare cattle business between Manypeaks and Green Range with his wife Georgina and parents Brian and Cathy Lester. The discussion draws on the crowd commentary and spans the practicalities of investing in a pivot, the challenge of watering points, strategies to establish perennials, and importantly, how to effectively transition cattle onto these new pasture varieties without losing weight gain momentum.
We started seeing the ability in this climate to fatten cattle on the fringes, on the shoulder periods of the spring, and making the most of the mild conditions here and the wet climate, obviously, and also the premium prices that you can get if you can finish a bit before or a bit afterwards, after the spring flush. So that obviously has led into us looking into alternative cropping a bit more, as far as, you know, we've got a traditional ryegrass, clover, kikuyu base through all the properties, which in itself has been very successful in fattening cattle when the feed is there. But obviously, as we moved into trialling grass feeding all year round, we run into the issue of keeping feed to the cattle. And that either had to be bought in, which is expensive, or potentially starting to grow it. So over the last 5 years, we've gradually increased the grass-fed production. It's been a challenge, learning how to finish the cattle as required, which, as Tim spoke about before, is the consumer demand for finished beef has obviously increased, but also there's been niche markets open up with the grass-fed stuff that we're doing. So we've been gradually trying to work our way through it. We supplement cattle in the autumn periods, or summer and autumn periods, with a pellet. We approached Milne Feeds with that, which is now known as the Easy Grass. And like I said, we've just been trying to feel our way with animal nutrition, working with Jess, soil nutrition with James and Cole, and then obviously growing plants that are a bit different to the norm, and trying to grow feed in these shoulder periods that are our expensive periods for finishing cattle.
This is becoming a key component of your finishing system, and I'd love you to give us a bit of background of the experience that you've acquired in setting it up.
Well, we're hoping, Tim, that it'll be a key component. We're certainly in the early stages of working out how it fits in our system. As I said, it grew sorghum this summer, which we did a bit right, we did a fair bit wrong. We put on a bit over 12,000 kilos of beef. We did 3 grazings on it. Mid-November it was sown, and our first grazing was in mid-January, and we grazed it pretty much three times with varying mobs. And yeah, the average was we did about 1.2 kilos on it, which was probably a little bit disappointing. I was happy enough with it, but we aim to be a bit better. Sorghum was mainly a clean-up crop. It was meant to be into perennial rye and clover now, but we've obviously been held up with the weather. So we're hoping to make it the centrepiece of being able to have feed in those shoulder periods that I spoke about before.
You've had some challenges, and everyone wants to hear about other people's challenges. Are you happy to talk about those?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. What was the biggest challenge to start out with?
we, in hindsight, left it a culmination of things. We sowed it reasonably early for the weather that we had. You'd all know that we had quite a mild December, so it didn't really grow as quickly as we thought. And I know another pivot that with the same Zambonetti's pivot was sown a bit later and actually had a bit more vigour, just because it got into the warmer weather. Where that led was we timed our run wrong with the fertiliser over the Christmas break and couldn't get it on. Subsequently, that delayed our grazing because we wanted to get more growth. So the crop was probably a bit mature when we grazed it, and that we're attributing, along with some of the stuff Jess will talk about, the weight gain that was a bit lower because we grazed it a bit late. In hindsight, we should have done it a bit earlier. Also, just setting up the paddock, we deep ripped it twice, and then incorporated 3 tonne of lime and 1.5 tonne of gypsum. Just doing that obviously changes the makeup of the ground and the paddock.
How did you manage the transition between the sorghum grazing period and the semi-feedlotting? Can you tell us a little bit about that non-centre pivot period and how you worked between the two?
The cattle are on, as I spoke about before, on the grass pellet, and they're given hay and straw as well. It's a bit hard to, it's obviously a lot greener now, but the paddocks pretty much were just stubble. So there was minimal grazing in the paddock. So they would go from that then into the sorghum with access to the pellet and the hay and the straw. We found they didn't really eat a lot of hay, obviously, because they were chasing the sorghum, and the pellet intake really dropped. So, yeah, it was... We had it in pies, pretty much in quarters, and that was the other challenge, was with a crop growing so quickly, being able to graze it quickly and move the cattle on. And the challenge also being, when you've got sorghum, it's a shame we don't have a photo, but it was sort of this high, putting 300 head into it with one white tape was, yeah, it was a big mob a couple of times. And that was another challenge that we had, was trying to get 2 mobs in. We had a mob of steers and a mob of heifers in on opposite pies, and they ended up all in the same pie. And then we had steers jumping on heifers, and a bit of an incident where I think some of the steers didn't realise where the water trough was. And so that all, I think, resulted in some poorer weight gains. But that then, what we learnt from that is it ties back into the grazing it earlier and quicker. And also maybe training your cattle with tapes a bit before.
I'm going to swing to Jess. Jess, can you talk a little bit about that transition and how you keep their dietary intake as even as possible, and what the value of that is?
It's always easy for me to come in and say, oh, well, you should have done X, Y, Z, and then everything would have been hunky-dory. So it's great that Kim's able to share some real life experience about the limitations with transitioning between crops. So I guess if we just go back to basics, so you've got to remember or think about how it is that a cow actually functions. So a lot of the digestion that goes on inside a cow is actually not the cow herself. It's the microbes that are within her rumen. So they're the ones that are doing the work. So we feed the bugs that are inside the cow, the bugs feed the cow, and then we get our beef. So I guess we just got to always have that in the back of our mind when we're transitioning between different feeds, whether we're talking about going from a full confinement type situation where they're on a full ration, or we're going from a pasture like there is behind us onto a lush crop. So the way that the rumen works is there's billions and billions of different bugs in there, that some of them are bacteria, some are young fungi, some are yeast. There's a heap different of types in there, and they will eat different substrates. Then they produce products which the cow can then use for energy for growth. So we need to meet the requirements of those bugs in the rumen. So first of all, we've got to have the energy there. That's pretty simple. We've also got to have the protein, but we've also got to have the fibre there as well. So the biggest thing with transitioning from onto a lush pasture is to make sure that we're balancing those three components. So it takes the rumen microbes quite a while to adjust. It takes around about sort of 10 to 14 days for them to adjust to a pasture type situation. A little bit longer when you're talking about grain, that's sort of 21 to 28 days. So you've always got to have that in your back of your mind when you're thinking about how long is it going to take them to fully adjust onto the crop. Some crops are going to be higher risk than others. So we've got our really hot pastures like our brassicas, which I'm sure a few of you have been mucking around with. They need a bit more of an adjustment period than something like just a cereal or grass type pasture. So coming on to Kim's pivot, whether it's a pivot or not, the transition period is still really important. So if you have that in the back of your mind that it's going to be taking around about 2 weeks for them to adjust, what can you do in that period to ease that transition? And if you get that right, then we shouldn't be seeing any health issues. So we shouldn't be seeing problems with acidosis, bloat, mineral imbalances, metabolic issues, those sorts of things. So the main thing that Kim sort of touched on was they had a fibre source there for the cattle. And he obviously saw a reduction in the intake of that fibre source because they were preferentially choosing to eat the sorghum. Sometimes you'll see the opposite scenario depending. So some of the brassica crops, they've never tried it before, it might not be as palatable. You might see the opposite, where they hug your fibre source and they're not eating your pasture. So you really want to find that balance between you're meeting their fibre requirements, but you are still utilising your pasture. And that's where it's a bit of a problem-solving exercise to do that. And Kim sort of touched then on educating your cattle before you put them on the pasture so they know what they're doing. And that's where strip tapes can really come in. This afternoon when we go to Kent's, you'll see what he's been doing with the strips. But they're a great tool where you can allocate a small percentage of the crop to the cattle at a time so they get a taste for it, and you eventually increase the amount of access that they're getting over time. That way you can balance the amount of fibre that they're eating compared to the amount of crop that you're offering them. Another really important point there as well is the water source. So in the rumen, depending on the size of your animal, they could have between 50 and 100 litres of water in there. And the rumen microbes need that water to live. So as soon as we start limiting water, we start having issues with the health of that gut. So Kim, can you talk about what actually happened with the water source and what you could do in future to try and reduce that from happening again?
What happened, we had the two mobs, and we had a trough over the back, and then two along the other fence. Because we were in the early, we're developing it and working out where we were going to put troughs. The plan is to have two troughs on either side. We didn't have enough troughs, and so we had one over the back for the steers and then one over here for the heifers. We had a box up, and they were only about 3 days off, or 2 or 3 days off coming out and coming off the pivot, and we just left them in one mob, and we needed the other trough. It hadn't rained by then. We needed the other trough at another farm, so we stole the steers trough, thinking that they would work it out, and it still is a little bit of a guess as to what happened. But when we weighed the steers, what we found was there was a percentage of them, the majority of them were doing really well, but then there was about a quarter of the mob of just steers. When they got into the yards, they were chasing water, and they were the ones that had the weight gain issue. So what I concluded was, and talking to Jess about it too, was that's been their trough they were used to. We've taken it away, and then some of them haven't worked out that there was another one, because obviously the sorghum being quite high, that's what we put it down to. So it was probably just a lesson learned that, just need to be conscious of the water source and where they are, and not take for granted that cattle are just going to find it themselves.
Kim, can you speculate a little bit about the time frame that this pivot system is likely to enable you to finish, and what other species you might consider in pasture species putting in there to extend its use through the summer and autumn?
Yeah, basically, Tim, the idea is, like I said before, the sorghum was just more of a weed control and just something that we could get something growing and get a bit of, you'll see there's a fair bit of trash, a bit of organic matter into the soil. The plan is to go to a perennial ryegrass and will be base ryegrass and then a Rubitas red clover and a white clover, so a perennial clover. And we're hoping that'll give us year-round production in that we can graze it once we get it up and going. It should hopefully be sown in the next week or 10 days, with the idea of perhaps getting a grazing before a lock-up, cut silage off it, then water it up and keep steaming. The problem that I had with the sorghum was it's a very big and impressive crop. Everyone likes to look at a big tall crop, but we had a period we cut silage basically the end of October, early November, and we didn't have cattle back into this paddock until late January. So we had a sort of 2 to 3 month period where it was producing nothing. So the idea is going to be to get a perennial system that we can cut silage off it, fertilise it and water it straight away, and hopefully be grazing again within 6 weeks.
I'd love to, at the risk of running some back of envelope maths, just talk about how many hectares are in here.
It's 38, the pivot's 32 and the whole paddock's 38. If you add it all together, it was basically just over 1,050 head grazed for 11 days. But effectively we had a 10-day period in the peak with 1,000 head that basically weren't needing fed and were doing as good, if not better, weight gain than what they were doing in the paddock.
Would you be better off running a quarter as many for far longer?
Yeah, I think that's probably something we've learnt is balancing the best. I've spoken to Kent about this at length as well. There's a balance between animal production and feed production, and sometimes peak feed production comes at the cost of your animal production. So the best case for a fast-growing crop like sorghum is to get in, get it nailed and get off. But how you balance that with being able to keep up with the crop growing is, I don't know that we're 100% over that, but I think basically we need to get it into smaller portions and possibly smaller mobs, but have multiple mobs grazing, because if we were to go into say 10 segments in here and put 100 head in that segment, they wouldn't, by the time they got around, the next lot would need grazed. But also with a pivot, we've got to work out, it would be much easier with sheep because they're a lot lighter. When you water with a pivot, it's 12 mil is a fair bit of water going out. And so you've got to sort of work out where your cattle are when you're watering. So you can't really have square systems. It's pie shaped, and that creates challenges. As you'd know, no one designs paddocks in triangles because you get points where cattle all run and then blow tapes. So yeah, we've got to balance the two.
On that note, Kim, have you considered doing portable water systems where you've got portable troughs? A bit like they use in New Zealand?
Definitely considered it, and that the idea with, initially we thought, well, we'll put water on each corner, but the issue with cattle again comes into, and it's a bit hard to tell now, but in each corner, pretty much that's where we had our feed source and our water source, and they bog it up. So you can't, the idea of fencing a pivot neat and putting a trough right here, like if we were to put a trough right here, we lose production on our pivot. So my thinking is we don't have any water anywhere near the pivot site because cattle congregate there and we're not going to have any crop. So that's the idea of having the troughs 1, 2, 3, 4 just outside the pivot line on the 6 hectares that isn't irrigated.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Did you consider, or could you consider, a multi-species planting in your sorghum at the beginning of your grazing? Just mentioned that cereals have a different effect in the gut than sorghum. So could the first hectare or so include a cereal, so they start grazing the cereal with the sorghum in it, and then gradually in your plantings go over to a sorghum?
Yeah, definitely. That is if we were to continue with something, a monocrop, definitely I reckon that's a good idea. We saw that, we did some trials with Raphno last year, 2 years ago, and we planted we inter-row cropped or split rowed raphno with oats, and then we had straight raphno, and we put cattle in both. And the cattle, they were both in there for 10 days. And the cattle in the straight raphno put on no weight. The cattle that were in the inter-rowed with oats did 1.5. So that if we were to continue with the say a raphno or a sorghum, I reckon that definitely would be something you would consider do a pie. And if it was a smaller mob, as we spoke about before, 150 or 100, and you could put them on that pie for the induction period, and Jess would know more about this, but it seems to be around that 8 to 12 days or around 10 days. So I guess if you could do it to that, it definitely would work.
So pastures are no different to making up a grain ration. You've got to balance it. And there's no one plant species that we have that meets energy, protein, fibre requirements and trace elements for cattle. So that's definitely where you need to start looking at doing mixed species in your pasture, or adding in a supplement to help, whether that's a silage or a hay or a straw on the side.
I think, Hayley, would you like to comment on the different species mix and what other options there might be?
I think Jess has said it really well. It's about balancing their needs, but it's also about them learning that it's feed and learning what to eat. So productivity is about 50% due to how much they eat. So intake is really, really important, as well as the nutritional value of that feed. So if they go into something new, eat too much and get a gut ache, their brain and stomach is having a really good communication about that, and they're going to go off that feed and you're going to have a decreased intake for quite a while. So giving them mixtures allows them to balance their needs, and you tend to, if you can get through that introductory period with a mixture, as suggested, you're going to get much better productivity and much higher intakes. I love the idea of white clover, red clover and perennial ryegrass. White clover is the highest nutritional value forage that we have. So it's the queen of forages, 75% dry matter digestibility, so you're going to get much higher intakes and higher levels of productivity, but the perennial grass will help the animals manage their fibre needs. So there's a reason why it's really popular in the irrigated parts of the world. So in terms of irrigated species, I think they're the ones to go for this region if you can get the water to them. So it's really about what recovers best from grazing and grows faster.
The thing to put into perspective, the cattle on the straight raphno wouldn't have had an induction period. They were put straight in there. So having that mixed oat and raphno is a great way to induct them onto that diet. And if they'd gone from there and then transitioned onto the raphno, the weight gain might have been better, because the recommendation is more about a 3, 4, 5 day induction period where you're only putting them there for longer periods of time every day, and making sure they've got enough access to roughage and any appropriate supplements.
So that transition period, if you get it right, cattle should be gaining weight. We don't want to see them losing weight or even maintaining weight, because there's obviously an opportunity cost with that. Can you just run through the figures that you worked out when you did the trial between the straight raphno and the raphno with the oats? And this will help emphasise James's point about needing to have this good transition period from an economical point of view.
Yeah, well, pretty much at the time, because we planted raphno in, I think it went in late August, early September. So its first grazing was on the back end of our spring period. So most of our cattle were doing 1.5 to 2 kilos a day on grass. So it was easy at the time for people to say, oh, well, you've got an induction period where they're not really going to do a lot. But when we worked that out at 1.5 kilos a day at the time, I think if the rough price was $3.50 live, if we had 400 head in one mob that didn't do anything, and then the 200 in the smaller paddock that did 1.5 kilos. If we work out 400 head at 1.5 kilos a day, or even 2 kilos a day at $3.50 or now $4.50, it ended up being that 10-day period, pretty much the opportunity cost or what was lost was around about 25 grand in lost production. The cattle still looked fine and there was probably compensatory gain afterwards, but being able to go have an induction period while we're still while we're perhaps taking a check, but not a big one, is definitely the way to go in a bigger system, because with the rough figures of that add up very quickly. And James is right. Once you get cattle on it, they can come off and go back on, and we see the production. That's fine, but it's certainly a big part of managing these new varieties is getting that induction period right.
So if they're spending most of their time, so 80% of their time in ryegrass still going forward, and then a short period of time getting longer each day, they're probably not going to go backwards, or they'll still be going forwards until they get used to that diet. So that might be that induction going into the mixed and then transitioning into the pure. But it's we're talking sort of 14 to 18% protein, 14 megs of energy, 85% digestibility. It's a lot hotter than what they've previously been used to. So it does need a period of induction to get them used to it. And
deep-rooted perennial in here, like chicory or something like that, is something you've considered?
Yeah, definitely considered it, but talking with James and Cole, we're just, what in our experience and the advice given with these perennials is sometimes throwing a whole heap at once perhaps isn't the right way to go. We've seen that at Green Range, that establishing a perennial sometimes has got to be a bit of a longer process, and then go back in with what we've done out there this year is, or the last couple of years, is establish lucerne and chicory together. They seem to work okay. And then now going back with an annual, like going back with oats or ryegrass or something on top of it. But yeah, I don't know the perfect answer down here. If we can get our heads around and or get a system in place that we are actually getting a bit of penetration below the traditional, a lot of the problem here is you look at it now, it's magnificent, it is, but if we get 3 inches of rain in the next 3 weeks, pretty much we evacuate this farm with cattle, because they just pug it, because we get wet so quick. So the idea, or the thinking is, talking with Cole and James, is just trying to maybe use a bit more of our sponge and have the ability where when it gets really wet, everyone gets wet. But I guess that ties into that shoulder period, is if we can just have a little bit more depth in our root systems, that they're going to be drawing moisture a bit longer. But also if there's more, what we're finding with more organic matter and more root systems and more matter on top, the cattle can track a bit better, and we don't end up with pugging, and as opposed to the traditional, we used to graze pretty hard and it just pugs, and then when it pugs, you're losing production. So.